institutional pressure towards two-tier justice is deeply embedded in the British state. And perhaps nowhere more so than the police. Few can have forgotten how during the weekly pro-Gaza marches after the 7th of October 2023, the Met made excuses for a man chanting jihad on the streets of London. Meanwhile, Telegraph columnist Alison Pearson was doorstepped by the Boys in Blue for having the temerity to suggest they had a tendency to take sides. Whatever happened to policing without fear or favour? Well, I'm very pleased to be joined today by someone who can tell us all about the wokeification of the police firsthand. And that's Paul Birch, who's a former Met police officer of 24 years service, including in counter-terrorism. Welcome to The Sceptic, Paul.
Thank you very much, Laurie. Good to be here.
Yeah, really good to have you here. Okay, so I think everyone will be very interested to hear about your time in the police. But I suppose just to start with, how obvious is the woke culture in the police from a day-to-day perspective?
As examples, not that I was going to say, no, it doesn't really relate to individual practice, but when you look on the sort of the intranet homepage, certainly the Metropolitan Police, you're greeted with sort of a wealth of articles on inclusion, diversity. There's a whole diversity directorate now. There are people who have sort of spent their entire career promoting diversity rather than doing actual policing. The police certainly the Metropolitan Police has diversity awards now for the most spurious, vague things. And every day, every month, whether it's Black History Month, International Women's Day, Trans Remembrance Day, the Met has it on their calendar. So you are reminded of what celebratory or commemorative day it is by looking at the calendar in the diversity section on the website. So yeah, it's all pervasive, I think.
And so obviously you've been there for quite a while. When did you first notice that things were becoming a bit more politicized, a bit more woke leaning in the police? And how has that changed over time?
Well, I joined the police in 2001. So in the first sort of couple of years after the Mcpherson report was published, now I guess the impact of that was being felt as I was joining. I think it's always been political since I've been there. I think the police, the senior ranks of the police are very concerned, and are very concerned about the reputation they had from years gone by, where they were perceived as being racist, specifically towards African Caribbean communities. And I think they're very, very sensitive to that. So it's always been there in my service. It's just that it became more noticeable over the years of service. I'll give you one example. When I joined, as I say, 2001, day one, week one of training school, I was presented in our class. We were all presented with these massive ring binders full of information, full of material that we were going to work through as part of our learning. So you open the cover, open to the first page, and you would imagine that there might be something relating to crime on there, on the very first page, or the founding principles of the police, the Pelian principles, let's say. But no, it was a map of Great Britain with a load of arrows over it, like something out of Dad's Army, like the titles to Dad's Army. And it had words like Angles, Saxons, Jutes, Romans, Celts, Huguenots, Jews, African Caribbeans, Asians, all next to these arrows, to various arrows. So, and the text underneath basically was saying that we are, we are a nation and a country of immigrants, and that different societies have contributed to the whole over the centuries. So it was, it was factually inaccurate, for one thing, in terms of the time period of immigration, the scale, and everything else. It was historically clumsy and inept, but they didn't care about that. They were trying to make a point, and this was 2001. So whether that came in the wake of the Mcpherson report, I don't know. But the politicised nature of policing has been there throughout my service, and has only become more noticeable as time has gone by. Saw a massive uptick in it when Theresa May became the Home Secretary, wanting. I think the police were making efforts to recruit more people from diverse backgrounds, but she didn't think it was going fast enough, and so that was ramped up significantly. And of course, 2020, the year of the killing of George Floyd in America, which was like a year zero, I guess, culturally. Everything changed after that. Even the police, the police openly discussed Black Lives Matter on forums. Senior officers who are currently behind the police race action plan were openly talking about working with Black Lives Matter, not as a concept, as a sort of an idea, but the organisation, which has since been completely discredited in terms of its aims and its propriety. So it's quite dangerous, really. I think they're jumping on political bandwagons much more overtly now, much more obviously since 2020. But to answer your question succinctly, it's been there throughout my service. But unfortunately, it's only becoming more and more apparent, I think, as time goes by.
Yes, it's interesting to hear about the different waves of it. But so obviously you were joining the police around the time, not of the Stephen Lawrence murder, but of the Mcpherson report into it. And I'm very interested in that in particular, because that is supposed to really have introduced the idea of institutional racism into the police and into the body politic more widely. Was that a particular influence, do you think, on the culture of the police around that time in the early noughties?
Yeah, I think so, because if you define something as institutional, that means, I think, that you can't really find any direct evidence of it. So if something's systemic or institutional, anyone can make any assertion, and no one can argue against it. Really, because if something's institutional, it's that deeply embedded that you don't even notice it yourself. So there were, the whole issue of the Stephen Lawrence, tragic case of Stephen Lawrence, and the inept investigation. I think the sentiment from the Mcpherson report was that, we didn't care because, excuse me, we didn't care, or the police didn't care, because it was just a young black man who was murdered. Now, I don't think that would have been the case at all from all the people I've known in my service. All the people, nearly all the people I've met on the front line who do the job at the sharp end, they're extremely dedicated people, and I can't, and they always have been, like throughout my service. So I can't imagine people being like that. So I guess the idea of institutional racism came into the equation very, very quickly, because you couldn't identify any overt racism in the case. You couldn't identify any overt racism within the police. So it was a campaign that was politicized very, very quickly. So I guess they wanted an answer that would satisfy the understandable feeling that, when this lad had been murdered by a bunch of thugs, racist thugs, as it turns out. They wanted answers. They wanted answers as to why it happened and why no one at that time had been convicted. I know 2 people have been convicted since, but if you class an institution as racist at its very core, which is what this did, then you can just throw allegation after allegation, and it's very, very hard to sort of argue against it, because if you're institutionally racist, it's so embedded in your culture that you can't do much about it. Although, looking at modern policing, some of the language and terminology they use in their diversity directorates are very, very sort of activist orientated, using the same terminology, the same phrases. So although I don't think institutional racism or systemic racism is actually a thing, the senior echelons very much think it is, and are trying to address what they think is a real problem. And so they're heading down the road of sort of activism, really, I think, which is dangerous for all of us.
And so you mentioned that things kicked up a gear a bit under Theresa May and from 2010. So there's obviously a few different changes going on at that point. One of them is the public sector equality duty, which comes in obviously at the end of Labour there, but comes in 2010. But there's also, in 2012, the introduction of the College of Policing. And this goes hand in hand with the so-called professionalisation of the police. And do you think that marked a significant change in police sort of elite culture and it becoming a bit more wokeified?
Yes, very much so. I think, the same. I think the same legislation brought in the National Police Chief Council and police and crime commissioners as well. So none of which I think are of the remotest use to the police or to fighting crime. I think the idea of the College of Policing, because you had the Fire Service College, the Royal College of Nursing, it gave it a more professional sheen, or the people that brought it in would think that it gives it a more professional sheen. I think the organisation, the institution, was professional enough before the College of Policing. And individual chief constables, individual seniors in the 43 police forces around the country had more autonomy to deal with things as they saw fit. The idea of a college of policing standardized a lot of responses to certain issues, a lot of policies and strategies, many of which unfortunately seem to be politically motivated, or at least following the latest socio-political trends. Regarding there are so many. You can just about every issue in policing, every crime issue, you can see a sort of political stance being taken by the NPCC on it.
Just to come in for a second, I mean, you mentioned that it was actually professional enough already, in your view. Was there a bit of snobbery involved in saying that this discipline, which actually was getting along perfectly fine, needed so-called professionalisation and needed to be sort of improved in some way?
Yeah, I think there always was a lot of snobbery concerning the police, and there still is. To a lot of people, the police are just seen as plod, even now, who haven't really got much of a brain. And I think the people who established, or the government at the time and the senior officers at the time, thought it would give it more respectability. There'd be less likelihood of just being labelled as plod. Unfortunately, the upshot of it is that it's been hijacked at senior levels by progressive values. So you'll get the people, the cohort of society who are always going to dislike the police, still think that the police are plod and pretty stupid. So the people at the National Police Chiefs Council and the College of Policing think that by becoming more and more progressive with policies and practices, that will bring those people on side, and it never will. It never will. And all you're doing is alienating the vast majority of the public who don't want the police to be political. And that's in my experience, that's totally independent of anyone's racial background, their religion, their gender, or anything else. Most ordinary, quote unquote, people want the police to deal with the job, deal with crime, not deal with society's ills, because that's not what the police are there for. That's a much bigger problem than the police, obviously. But with bodies like the College of Policing and the NPCC, it seems now that seniors are at least willing to go into or to get involved in the discussions around, the ills of society, and problems which are much wider than the police. And that's not their job. Their job, well, according to the Pelian principles, their job is to prevent crime from happening. The number one principle is to, rather than deal with crime, is to stop it happening. Obviously, you can't do that, so you have to do your best. But another one of the principles, the fifth of the 9 principles, is to not pander to public opinion, and to work independent of government. Now, I would suggest that they do pander to elite opinion very, very much, and they pander to sort of Home Office, civil service, woke thinking. You see it all the time, with only last week the NPCC publicly stated that they disagreed with the view of the CPS that Alison Pearson case should not have been looked into further. The CPS the police ultimately took heed of CPS advice, which was there was no realistic prospect of a conviction. And the NPCC's report into Essex Police's handling of that stated publicly in the report that we do not agree with the cancellation of the investigation. Well, it's not their place to think that. What other reason would there be to publicly disagree with that other than taking an activist stance? They didn't even agree that the matter shouldn't at least result in a non-crime hate incident. They thought there should have been at least one of those. So it's like sort of a certain vindictiveness. If we can't get her for inciting racial hate, you can at least throw an NCHI at her. And they didn't agree with that either. And this is the NPCC, publicly disagreeing with the Crown Prosecution Service. Well, that's not their job. And they certainly shouldn't be saying it in public. I mean, I've been involved in lots of investigations where you express exasperation at the CPS decision in private with your colleagues, but you never publicly go on the record and say that we disagree with it, because that's how the system works. So it shows a lot of hubris, a lot of arrogance, and that's what you get now with woke policing at senior levels, unfortunately, I think.
And so you mentioned this stuff at a senior level, and I think people will be very interested to hear how pervasive this is, because of course not every police officer is a woke warrior, right? And lots of police do a very good job. So what is the ratio between those who are really true believers in this stuff and those who perhaps more are just going along to get along, do you think?
Well, anecdotally, virtually nobody agrees with it. Talking to people at work when I was in the job, people would speak about it in hushed tones in the office, that it's a load of rubbish. Excuse me. And even the people who are espousing this stuff in meetings and during presentations, when you meet them privately after work, a lot of them would say that they don't really believe in it, but as you said, they've got to do it to get along. And I think it's so ingrained now that there's no possibility of anybody reaching senior ranks to dismantle this system if they don't at least say they believe in it or perpetuate policies which enshrine this stuff in police practice. So, the short answer is no one on the shop floor really believes in it. I've actually heard no one ever that's publicly or even in conversation stated that this is brilliant, all this stuff. No, I've not heard a single person that says that. Senior levels, they'd have to. Mate, I'm sure some of them believe in it, but no one I've ever spoken to at that level believes in it. Or at least they just say they need to go along with it. And on the shop floor, no, it's people can see that that it doesn't work with policing. It should all be about. It should be a meritocracy, like every branch of government, every branch of any society really should be a meritocracy, but it isn't. So no, it's very, very unpopular, but it doesn't negate the fact that it's ingrained now in policing, I think, unfortunately.
And so you mentioned meritocracy there, and so of course there's this idea of community policing and diversity hiring as well, which Theresa May in particular accelerated. How prevalent is that, and what are the effects of it?
The effects of it are you will get people at levels of serious responsibility who shouldn't be there because of their lack of ability. People promoted well beyond their pay grade or what their pay grade should be. And we're not talking about a marketing manager of a high street chain, are we? We're talking about policing. If things go wrong, if a senior police officer gets it wrong, potentially people can die. Like Hillsborough, for example, when the Gold Commander sort of froze on the day, and you had scores of people dying. Now that was all down. A significant amount of that was down to the senior police officers' decision making, not just the individual Gold Commander, but other senior officers. Now that is an extreme example, but that could happen, and does happen regularly, because you have people that are promoted due to what they represent rather than who they are and the qualities they possess. I know now that if there are promotion processes or vacancies for different roles, people of protected characteristics get extra training, extra coaching for those roles. So they can't turn around and say, we have hired these particular people for this role because of their colour, of their gender, because that's illegal, isn't it? Technically that's illegal, but they do everything else to make sure that that is the case, by giving people an awful lot of extra training, extra coaching, and that's written down in their practices, in their policies. It's not something they hide, and people go along to it to get that training, and I don't blame them. Of course you don't. If the opportunities are there for you, it's not about those individuals. It's about the organisation skewing things in favour of certain people because of their immutable characteristics. And logic states that you are going to get occasionally the wrong people in the wrong job. And yeah, it's dangerous. It is dangerous.
And so, of course, a big part of the rationale for that is this idea of community policing, right? So it's that, you'd have black people policing black people, Asians policing Asians, and then they can somehow be more sensitive to these different communities. And, well, I mean, this is an idea of which I'm very much inclined to be critical, but nevertheless, is there something to be said for that? Does this representative policing help in any way?
I don't think there's any evidence whatsoever that makes a difference, personally. And I know from speaking to various colleagues and members of the public during my time that they're much more concerned, certainly members of the public are much more concerned that the officer they meet, if they need to call the police, does a good job, rather than they have the same colour of skin that as they do. That doesn't really come into it, or if it does, it will be way down the list. If their house has been burgled, or they have a member of their family who's been attacked, they would much rather the officer of a different ethnic background who does a good job than someone of the same ethnic background who doesn't do a good job. And people have found it. I've spoken to people who find it insulting that they need to be addressed by people of the same background as them. And that's compartmentalizing people, the very thing that they claim they're working against. If diversity is a great thing, and it's like that, diversity is our strength. It's a mantra now that you hear everywhere. Well, surely then, if you're talking about a diverse police service or police force in old money, then it shouldn't matter whether the officer who comes to your door is of the same background as you, or the same gender or faith, or what have you. It should be utterly irrelevant. But they're making it more and more of a factor now, I think. And I don't think there's any evidence for that. I appreciate that in past times that there is a lot of suspicion between the certain communities and the police. I get that. I understand that. But that doesn't have to be addressed by just recruiting people from those backgrounds. People from those backgrounds come into the job and they're really good at it. Great, fantastic. And I know, lots of officers from lots and lots of different backgrounds, and they're utterly, utterly dedicated, professional, good people. But that's because they're good people. It's not because they happen to be black, or happen to be Asian, or happen to be female, or happen to be this, happen to be that. It's because they're good officers, and that's how it should work. And I think you just get down, you go down deeper and deeper rabbit holes if you get into the whole politics of race in policing and trying to adjust your sort of staff levels by race and gender. It's the last thing that the police should be thinking about, But it seems to be the first thing they're thinking about these days, unfortunately, and they have been for a long time.
Because you'd think that the encounter between the individual citizen and the state would be colorblind, right? And that's how it should be. And so surely the entire idea of community policing is undermining policing without fear or favour and undermining equality before the law. I mean, it can't really be any other way, can it?
No, it does. It completely undermines it. Community policing, to me, means going back to the way it was done many years ago, long before I joined, when you had, I know people, it's a bit of a cliche, but police officers on the beat. They took an operational decision in the 60s to put everybody in cars. So you could have fewer officers covering much greater ground. But the trouble is, the minute you stick them in a car, you've got a barrier between yourself and the public, haven't you? You've got a fast-moving vehicle, less opportunity to get out and chat to people, or you only go to see people when there's an emergency. What they need to do, community policing, to me, is not about different policing strategies for different ethnic groups. It's about the same thing for every ethnic group, every community. Or it shouldn't be about groups at all. It should be about the area the police are working in, whether that area happens to be predominantly black population, white population, Muslim population, whatever, or a mixture of all of them. If you have police officers of whatever background doing the old-fashioned thing and walking, and it sounds a bit hackneyed now, but that is what people hark back to, and that is where you get the police community relations, by just walking amongst people. Yes, you can have the cars and the backup, of course you can, but what that would mean is a massive recruitment drive, and a lot of money being spent. So I'm not sure that's going to happen. So when people talk of community policing now, they talk of a safer neighbourhood unit that you can't get hold of, that does a token foot patrol once every few weeks down the high street. Otherwise, you'll never see them, you never hear of them. They have a workload, a list as long as your arm of things to get through. So the chances of your concern about antisocial behaviour in the market being addressed is virtually nil, because everything that's not emergency policing lands at your door. So I think the community officers, safer neighbourhoods officers, and police community support officers, I don't envy their role whatsoever, because they're the people. When people talk about community policing, the focus now is all on them, on teams like that, and they can't physically cope with the workload. So when senior officers say they've put this much money into safer neighbourhoods, well, I don't know of many safe. I could be wrong, and I hope I'm wrong, but I'm sure there are some. But you hear many instances of people being totally dissatisfied with their local safer neighbourhood team. Probably because they're over. It's not because they're not good or they don't care. It's because it's impossible to cope with that workload with a minimal amount of people. So if you go back to the very, very basics of having lots of police officers walking up and down, then maybe that can be addressed.
Yes, I know that Peter Hitchens talks about that quite a lot. Okay, and so finally, I think a big source of neurosis in the state and a lot of this diversity stuff is kind of an inability to deal with inequalities or disparities. And so, yeah, you mentioned earlier the London Race Action Plan. And there's various things in that which are quite really bizarre. But one of the dynamics is that, of course, as we've mentioned, there's this push for diversity, hiring for more, representative police officers, as it's called. But then on the other hand, there's a great concern with the fact that these, police officers haven't been hired. They are getting disciplined at higher rates. And of course, these two goals are self-contradictory. If you're making it easier for one group of officers to get into the force, then probably they are going to be of a lower standard. They may well commit disciplinary things that get them disciplined at a higher rate. And so there's this kind of deranged attitude in the people who have ideas about how the police ought to be run or not to be run. And it seems to stem in particular from an inability to accept that there might be some disparities.
It is, and it's an inevitable consequence of looking at recruitment just in terms of figures. The desire to get people of different backgrounds, as many people as possible, through the door and into the service. So inevitably, you're not going to carry out some as accurate vetting. Or if you do, the vetting process is going to get stuck or get jammed up with the amount of people going through the system. So inevitably, they slacken the system. So you get the wrong people through sometimes. So that's something that they can't address. You either do the vetting process properly, in which case you're going to get long delays of people coming in, and maybe not this sort of demographic figures that you would like, or you loosen off the system, which is what has been occurring, and you occasionally get the wrong people through of whatever background. Yes, I know that they are looking at disparities between disciplinary outcomes involving white officers and non-white officers. And they try to say, or it certainly imply that there's a race aspect to that in terms of the disciplinary process. I find that I don't find that credible, to be honest with you. If someone breaks the rules, they break the rules. Someone should get as fair hearing as anybody else. What they've tried to say, I know I attended certain workshops and sessions before I left. What they said was that the reason that more non-white officers proportionally go through the disciplinary system than white officers is that people, because they don't want to discuss issues of performance with non-white officers like the supervisors, they don't address it. They don't address it by way of a chat. In the first instance, they wait to let it get to such a serious level that it warrants disciplinary action, and therefore that officer is then in the disciplinary system. Now, I don't know where that view came from. I know that in my time, if ever I had an officer who was underperforming or behaving inappropriately that hadn't crossed a threshold into disciplinary action, you would do anything as a supervisor, as a manager, to avoid that. Because for one thing, it means you've got to write loads and loads of reports, and you've got to have loads of meetings, loads of sessions. So the idea that you would, if someone's, for example, say a Muslim officer is behaving inappropriately, that you would not speak to that officer just in the hope that it would go away, and then obviously it'd get worse and worse. I mean, it's ridiculous. You just wouldn't. I mean, morally, you wouldn't do it. For the officer's career, you wouldn't do it. And for the sake of your own workload, you wouldn't do that. So that's what they said at this meeting I attended, was that is why more non-white officers fell foul of the disciplinary process, is that people didn't want to deal with them informally, so they just let it get worse and worse, and so it had to be dealt with formally. I just think that's rubbish. That's just rubbish. I think London, I'm just speaking of London here, because it's my experience. London is so diverse now, and people from so many different communities around the world, that if you want to get people from those communities into the organisation, which is laudable, people every individual in every different community is going to have a slightly different set of values and a different moral compass. It doesn't, again, they sort of tarring everybody with the same brush. They would think all people who have a Hindu faith or Muslim faith or from a Caribbean background are the same. That's just not true. That's not true, and it's very patronising. So I think to sort of bend the rules to accommodate people with different cultural beliefs and cultural norms, it's clearly, if you look at some of the instances recently, you are making a rod for your own back as an organisation. You're allowing the reputation of an institution that's already pretty low to get even lower. And the ordinary people of this country who just want the police to do an ordinary job, you're alienating them still further. If more people of different of non-white backgrounds are through the disciplinary process, their first thing to think of is that it must be racist, which is, it's dangerous, it's foolish, and it can only have negative consequences if they don't change that, I think.
Okay, well, Paul Birch, thank you very much for coming on The Sceptic.
Thank you, Laurie. Thank you very much.